The snow came without warning. By 6:15 in the evening, Chicago had disappeared beneath it, the skyline swallowed, the streets emptied, the lakefront reduced to a white hiss of wind and static. Margaret Caldwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her 43rd floor office and watched the city erase itself, the way she had learned to watch most things, without expression, without comment, without letting it mean anything she could not immediately contain. She was 58 years old. She had run Caldwell Aerospace for 19 of those years, first alongside her husband and then, after his death, alone. The company had grown under her direction from a regional aircraft components manufacturer into one of the largest private aerospace contractors in the country. 3,000 employees. Contracts in 11 states. A defense deal currently in final negotiation that, if signed, would represent the single largest revenue event in the company's history. She had everything she was supposed to have. She put on her coat at 6:20 and took the private elevator to the lobby. The main entrance was undergoing brass fixture repairs that evening, which meant the contractors had propped the revolving door open and redirected foot traffic through the public lobby, the route Margaret almost never used. She came through it tonight without thinking, the way you take a different path when your usual one is blocked. And that small redirect was the reason she saw him at all. The man was sitting on the steps outside the building's main entrance, his back against the wall beside the propped door, knees pulled to his chest. He wore a canvas jacket 2 sizes too large, the collar turned up against the wind. His boots were mismatched, one brown, one black. He had the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to move more than necessary in the cold, conserving heat the way people with very little learn to conserve everything. Margaret almost walked past him. Then she saw the necklace. It caught the light from the lobby, a brass compass rose pendant on a dark cord, no larger than a silver dollar. The kind of piece that looked simple until you understood what it was. Margaret had commissioned it from a jeweler in Evanston 7 years ago. She had held it in her hands the morning she gave it to Ethan, turned it over, read the inscription, on the back panel, that could only be seen when the pendant was opened, 4 words she had chosen herself, words she had never written down or spoken to anyone else. She stopped walking. The man did not look up. He was humming something low under his breath, and it took Margaret several seconds to understand why the sound made her chest tighten. It was not tuneless. It was a lullaby, a specific, unrecorded melody she had composed herself when Ethan was 3 years old and could not sleep without it. A song she had not sung since the night she received the phone call 7 years ago. "Where did you get that?" she said. He looked up. He had a young face under the grime and cold late 20s or early 30s, with careful eyes that held none of the hostility or wariness she might have expected. He looked at her the way people look at something they almost recognize. "Get what?" he said. "The necklace." He looked down at the pendant as though he had forgotten it was there. "I don't know," he said. "I have always had it, I think." "Take it off," Margaret said. "Please." Something shifted in his expression, not fear exactly, but a kind of internal withdrawal, a closing down. He pressed the pendant against his sternum. "It is mine," he said quietly. "I know what is inscribed inside the back panel," Margaret said. 4 words. "If I tell you what they are, will you let me see it?" He said nothing. She told him the words. He stared at her for a long time. Then, slowly, he lifted the cord over his head and held it out. She opened the pendant with hands that were not entirely steady. The inscription was there exactly as she had specified, exactly as she had read it 100 times in the jeweler's photographs before pickup, exactly as it had existed in no other form, in no written record, in no place any stranger could have accessed. "North always brings you home." "What is your name?" she said. "Jesse," he said. "Jesse Calloway." He paused. "I think." Margaret did not call the police. She did not call Victor. She stood on the steps of her building in the snow for 40 seconds, making a calculation she could not have articulated, and then she said, "Come inside. I will get you something warm." He hesitated. She did not press him. She simply held the door open, and after a moment he stood and followed her. She brought him to the lobby seating area, a cluster of chairs near the security desk, and asked the night attendant to bring coffee and something to eat from the executive floor kitchen. While they waited, she watched him. He sat with his hands on his knees, glancing around the lobby with the cautious attention of someone cataloging exits. His eyes moved across the large format photographs on the walls: Caldwell aircraft, historic contracts, a framed portrait of the board, and stopped at the digital display screen near the elevator bank, where a rotating presentation of the company's new engine design was cycling through for a visiting delegation that had left hours ago. He leaned forward slightly, his head tilted. "That is wrong," he said. Margaret looked at the screen. "What is?" "That angle." He pointed a specific junction in the turbine assembly diagram, a stress point in the airflow modeling. "The load distribution at that junction. If the pressure differential exceeds threshold under cold weather conditions, the tolerances fail." He stopped. He looked at his own hand as though surprised to find it raised. I do not know why I said that." Margaret looked at the diagram. She knew exactly which junction he was pointing to. She had seen it before in handwritten notes, in a private engineering journal, in a report her son had been preparing to file in the weeks before his plane went down. Ethan had been the only person to identify that flaw. The report had never been submitted. She had been told it was lost in the accident. She looked at Jesse Calloway sitting in her lobby in mismatched boots, his hands slowly lowering, his expression confused and a little frightened by what had just come out of his own mouth. She made another calculation. "Is there somewhere you are staying tonight?" she said. He shook his head. "All right," she said. "I need to make a phone call." She called Diana Reeves at 7:40 that evening. Diana had spent 11 years as a federal aviation safety investigator before being removed from the Caldwell Flight 209 inquiry under circumstances that had never been fully explained. She now ran an independent safety consulting firm out of an office in Wicker Park. She and Margaret had not spoken in 6 years. When Margaret explained what had happened, there was a long silence on the line. "You are describing your dead son," Diana said. "I am describing a man who knows things he cannot know," Margaret said. "I need you to find out why. And if the answer is something you do not want to hear, then I need to hear it anyway," Margaret said. She arranged for Jesse to be seen at an independent medical clinic in Lincoln Park, not affiliated with any Caldwell entity, paid out of her personal account. She told no one at the company. She did not tell Victor. She told herself this was because she had no evidence yet, nothing worth presenting. But she understood, in a part of herself she did not examine closely, that the real reason was simpler. She did not yet know what she was protecting, or from whom. She drove home through the snow. She parked in the garage. She walked upstairs. At the end of the second-floor hallway was a door she had not opened in 7 years. She had not needed a reason to avoid it, she simply never stopped. Tonight she stood in front of it for a moment, her hand not quite touching the handle, and then she kept walking. In her bedroom, she sat on the edge of her bed and opened her phone. The calendar reminder was there, as it always was, set to recur annually. Ethan, March 12th. She had created it the year he died. She did not know why. She had never done anything with it. Every year it buzzed, and every year she dismissed it and went on with her day. She closed the calendar without changing anything. She did not sleep for a long time. The clinic on North Clark Street smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, the way all small medical offices do, a smell that belongs to no particular time of day and offers no comfort to anyone. Jesse sat on the paper-covered examination table with his jacket still on, watching the technician prepare the blood draw kit with the focused attention of someone memorizing a process they intended to reverse. Margaret had scheduled the appointment in advance under Jesse's name, a detail that would matter later, though neither of them knew it yet. She sat in the single chair beside the door. She had brought a folder of photographs. Ethan at 17, at 20, at 25. She had not shown them to Jesse yet. She was waiting for something she could not name. The technician pressed an alcohol swab to the inside of Jesse's left arm. He was off the table before the needle made contact. It was not a decision, it was a response, the way a hand pulls back from heat before the brain has processed the temperature. He was on his feet, back against the far wall, and the look on his face was not aggression, but something rawer and more difficult, a cornered terror that had nothing to do with needles and everything to do with something older. "I am not doing this," he said. His voice was level, but his breathing was not. "Jesse," Margaret began. "You want a sample." His eyes moved between her and the technician. "You want to run it against something. You want me to come back as a match." He pressed himself harder against the wall. "I do not know who you think I am, but I am telling you right now I am not him. I cannot be him. I do not remember anything before 4 years ago. Do you understand that? Nothing. And you are standing there with photographs in a folder and a needle, and I know exactly what you are building, and I will not be it." "I am not building anything," Margaret said. "You lost your son," he said. "I understand that. I am sorry, but I am not a replacement." He picked up his jacket from the table and walked out. Margaret sat very still in the chair for a moment, then stood, set the folder on the table, and called Diana. Diana found him 3 hours later through a grid of Lincoln Park security cameras, a slow, methodical trace that ended at the entrance of a small brick church on West Fullerton Avenue, where a hand-lettered sign in the window read, "Warm meals, warm welcome, no questions." The pastor, a large, soft-spoken man named Webb, who regarded Diana's investigator credentials with polite skepticism, confirmed that Jesse came by occasionally, not regularly. When the weather was bad, Diana went in alone. Margaret waited in the car. Jesse was sitting in a back pew with a paper cup of soup, and when Diana sat down beside him, he did not move away. She did not have a folder of photographs. She did not have a needle. She had a printed medical record and a question. "I am not here for her," Diana said. "I am here because I spent 11 years investigating airplane accidents, and the one that is connected to you is the only case I was ever pulled off of without explanation." She set the record on the pew between them. "This is your medical intake from the Lincoln Park Clinic. They pulled your records from the county system. You have been treated twice in the last 3 years, once at Cook County, once at a walk-in on Milwaukee Avenue. Both times, the intake notes mention a prior surgical implant, left shoulder, titanium. You told the nurse you did not know what it was from." Jesse looked at the paper. "I do not." "The serial code on that implant," Diana said, "matches a device manufactured by a single medical supplier and distributed to one facility in a 14-month window. The facility was Northwestern Memorial. The device was implanted in a 17-year-old patient following a left shoulder fracture sustained during a high school football game." She paused. "The surgery was paid privately. With no insurance filed, the family had chosen to keep the procedure out of any public record. There is no trace of it in any database a stranger would find. The patient's name was Ethan Caldwell." Jesse was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind pushed against the church windows. "That does not mean anything," he said. "Records get mixed up." "Titanium orthopedic implants are not reused," Diana said. "They are serial coded to individual patients. This one was coded to Ethan Caldwell and implanted in Ethan Caldwell's body." She looked at him directly. "I am not asking you to be anyone. I am asking you to let us keep looking." Jesse stared at the paper cup in his hands. "And if you find what she wants to find, then we deal with that when we get there," Diana said. "But if someone put you on a street without a name and a history that does not go back more than 4 years, then something was done to you that matters regardless of who you are." He did not answer for a long time. Then he said, "I have dreams about a number. 417206. I do not know what it means. I have never known what it means." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. "And sometimes I hear a bell, metal on metal, and I smell red paint." Diana wrote the number down. The following morning, Margaret went to the clinic without Jesse and asked the physician on record to pull whatever physical documentation existed from his prior treatments. The shoulder implant record was there. Something else was also there, a notation from the Cook County intake nurse, 3 years prior, flagging an anomaly in a routine chest X-ray. "A healed rib fracture pattern consistent with blunt trauma," the note said. And, "A secondary observation, patient appears younger than stated age. Possible documentation discrepancy." Margaret sat in the clinic waiting room and read the file 3 times. Then she drove to the address on file for Jesse's last known residence, a men's shelter on North Broadway, and asked if anyone remembered him. The intake coordinator pulled a handwritten log from 2 years ago. Jesse Calloway had stayed there for 6 weeks. He had listed his date of birth as March 12th. March 12th. Margaret sat in her car in the shelter parking lot and did not move for 11 minutes. She met with Jesse again that afternoon, at the church, with Diana present. She did not bring photographs. She sat across from him at a folding table in the church's side room and told him what they had found, the implant code, the intake notation, the birth date in the shelter log. Jesse listened without expression. "I need you to understand something," Margaret said, when she had finished. "I am not asking you to accept this. I am not asking you to call me anything, or come anywhere, or change your life. I am asking you to let us keep going. Because if someone took a life from you, your history, your name, your memory, you deserve to know who did it." Jesse was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You keep saying this is for me. It is. You signed off on covering up a safety report 7 years ago," he said. "Diana told me. Before your son's plane went down, you signed a non-disclosure order on a technical fault that Ethan had flagged. You did that to protect a merger." He looked at her without anger, which was somehow worse than anger. "I am not saying you are a bad person. I am saying you chose the company. You chose it then. And now the company is falling apart, and you need something to hold on to." He stood up. "I do not think I am the right thing to hold on to." He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "I will let Diana keep looking," he said, "but not for you, for me." Then he left. Margaret sat at the folding table in the church side room and said nothing. Diana did not fill the silence. There was nothing to fill it with. Diana Reeves had spent 11 years learning how airplane accidents actually happened, which meant she had also spent 11 years learning how they were made to look like something else. The difference, in her experience, was almost always paperwork, not the absence of it, but the presence of too much of it, filed too quickly, by people who knew exactly what they were preempting. The official report on Caldwell Flight 209 had been filed in 9 days. The average federal aviation incident investigation took 14 months. She had flagged this in her original inquiry. She had been removed from the case 4 days later, told the investigation was being consolidated under a different team, given no forwarding contact, and never called again. She had kept her notes in a fireproof box in her office closet for 7 years, the way investigators keep things they are not finished with. She opened the box the night after her conversation with Jesse at the church. The official report described a catastrophic structural failure at cruising altitude, a fuel line fracture leading to an engine fire, followed by rapid decompression and impact, with Lake Michigan, approximately 40 nautical miles offshore, 12 passengers, no survivors. Debris recovered over a 3-day search. Remains of 11 victims positively identified. 1 Ethan Caldwell identified through dental records submitted by the family's personal physician. Diana had always found that last detail uncomfortable. The family's personal physician, not a forensic odontologist, not an independent lab, a private practice dentist whose office was located 4 blocks from Caldwell Aerospace headquarters and whose clinic had held the company's employee dental contract for 16 years. She pulled the dentist's license number from the state registry. She cross-referenced it against a list of Caldwell Aerospace vendor payments she had obtained through a Freedom of Information request filed 6 years ago and never fully analyzed. The payment was there, dated 10 days after the crash, classified under a line item labeled Consulting Services, Medical Documentation, Review, $43,000. She sat with that for a while. Then she went back to the flight recorder data. The official report described the structural failure initiating at 31,000 feet. But buried in the raw telemetry, the unprocessed data file that had been included in the federal submission and then apparently never cross-referenced against the narrative summary, the altitude readings told a different story. The failure had not initiated at cruising altitude. The anomalous readings began at 4,000 feet, on the descent, within visual range of the shoreline. The plane had not gone down over open water. It had gone down close enough to the coast that a person in the water, in a life vest, in reasonable physical condition, could have been reached. Diana pulled the marine traffic logs for that date. 1 vessel appeared in the relevant zone at the relevant time. A maintenance tender registered to a private marine services company, operating under a contract with Caldwell Aerospace, for the routine inspection of a navigation buoy array the company operated as part of its avionics testing program. The tender's log showed it returning to harbor 2 hours after the crash, with no notation of unusual activity. No report had been filed with the Coast Guard. Diana called the harbor authority and asked for the name of the vessel's captain that day. The harbor authority told her he had retired. She asked for a forwarding contact. They gave her a phone number in Tucson, Arizona. She called it. A man answered on the third ring. She told him who she was. There was a silence that lasted long enough for her to understand that he had been expecting this call, in some form, for a long time. "I pulled him out of the water," the man said. "Young guy, maybe mid-20s. He was conscious when I got to him, but went under again before I could get him over the rail. I got him up eventually." He paused. He had a bad head injury. He was not making sense. "I radioed in, not to the Coast Guard. I radioed the dispatch number I had for the Caldwell maintenance contract. That was protocol. Any incident involving company assets." Another pause. "A man called me back within 20 minutes. Told me to bring him in to a private dock on the North Shore. Told me not to log it." "What was the man's name?" Diana said. "He said his name was Hale," the captain said. "Victor Hale." Diana brought this to Margaret on a Sunday evening. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Diana stopped talking, Margaret stood up and walked to the window. "Victor pulled him out of the water," she said. "It was not a question." "Victor arranged for him to be pulled out of the water," Diana said, "and then arranged for him to disappear into a private neurological facility under a false name. I traced the facility. It is a small long-term care unit in Evanston, closed now, but their archived records show an admission 2 days after the crash. Male patient, approximately 25 years old, severe traumatic brain injury, amnesia. Listed as indigent. No next of kin. Name on the intake form, Jesse Calloway." Margaret turned from the window. "Victor created the name. The name appears in no record prior to that intake form," Diana said. "No birth certificate, no social security filing, no school records, nothing. It was built from scratch." She set a folder on the desk. "I also found the payment records. Victor made 11 separate transfers to the facility over a period of 3 years through a shell account routed through 2 of Caldwell's subsidiary vendors. The facility was already struggling financially and preparing to close. Victor could not have found a replacement without leaving a far more visible trail. After year 3, when the facility began its closure process, the transfers stopped. Ethan had nowhere left to be contained. Victor calculated that a man with no memory, no name, and no resources was at that point less dangerous than continued active management. He let him walk out, and for 4 years, Margaret said quietly, he was right. She opened the folder. The payment records were there, the intake form, the harbor authority logs, the Marine captain's signed statement. She went through them one by one. Then she turned to the last document in the folder and stopped. It was a copy of a non-disclosure authorization dated 7 years ago, signed 4 days before the crash. It covered a technical safety report flagging a structural fault in a Caldwell engine design. Beneath it was a second document, a supplementary authorization filed 3 days later, extending the seal to include all internal communications about the fault, engine failure projections, maintenance, incident reports, a safety audit that had been flagged for regulatory submission. The audit covered a fault that had caused 2 non-fatal incidents in the preceding 18 months, 2 injured passengers, 1 ground crew member who had sustained a spinal injury during a maintenance procedure connected to the same fault. Both documents bore her signature. "You did not read the second one," Diana said carefully. "I believe Victor placed it in a stack of merger documentation and you initialed it without." "That is not an explanation," Margaret said. "That is a description of negligence." She closed the folder. "Jesse needs to know about this before anyone else tells him," she said. She told him the next morning. All of it, the tender, the facility, the payments, the false name, and her own signature on both documents. She sat across from him at the folding table and did not soften any of it. Jesse listened with his hands flat on the table. When she finished, he looked at the table for a long time. "Victor built his cover-up on top of yours," he said slowly, working through the architecture of it. "He needed your signature to exist. He could not have made the crash investigation go away. could not have created my name, could not have kept me in that facility without you having already sealed the record. Yes, Margaret said. I want to ask you something, he said. If you had known that morning when you signed that Ethan was about to go public with the same fault, that signing it would give Victor what he needed, would you have signed it anyway? The silence was very long. No, Margaret said, but I cannot prove that to you, and I understand if it does not matter. Jesse stood. He walked to the narrow window and looked out at the street. His reflection floated against the gray Chicago morning, a man who had spent 4 years being no one, standing in a church-side room, learning that the people who should have protected him had, in different ways and for different reasons, each failed to do so. I do not want to see you for a while, he said finally. Tell Diana to keep going, but I do not want to see you. He left. Margaret sat beneath the narrow window and let the silence be what it was. Victor Hale had built his career on timing. Not intelligence, he was intelligent, but so were many people who accomplished very little. Timing was the rarer thing. The ability to identify exactly when a situation was about to become uncontrollable, and to move before it did. He had known about Diana Reeves for 4 days before she knew he knew. The clinic on North Clark Street used a scheduling system that shared a back-end server with 3 other medical facilities in the Lincoln Park area, one of which had a data services contract with a Caldwell subsidiary vendor. A name flagged in the system: Jesse Calloway, scheduled by Margaret Caldwell's personal account. A cross-reference ran automatically. A notification reached his phone on a Tuesday evening while he was having dinner at a restaurant on Michigan Avenue, and he set down his fork and spent the remainder of the meal making quiet, unhurried decisions. He moved on a Thursday. By 9 in the morning, a package had been delivered to each member of the Caldwell Aerospace Board of Directors. The package contained a printed dossier, 14 photographs of Jesse Calloway taken over the preceding 2 years by a surveillance firm Victor had retained, showing Jesse sleeping in doorways, arguing with shelter staff, being escorted from a convenience store. A copy of Jesse's psychiatric intake record from Cook County, documenting 2 involuntary holds for erratic behavior and disorientation. A summary prepared by a private investigator describing Jesse as a known transient with a history of targeting vulnerable individuals in positions of grief or emotional distress. And a formal letter signed by 4 board members who had been briefed privately the evening before, requesting an emergency review of Margaret Caldwell's fitness to continue in her executive role. By 11, Margaret's building access had been suspended pending the review. By noon, 2 detectives from the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Division arrived at Diana's office in Wicker Park with a warrant. The warrant alleged that Jesse Calloway had gained unauthorized access to Caldwell Aerospace's internal engineering database through a third-party terminal, and that Diana Reeves had facilitated the access. Jesse was brought in for questioning and held. Margaret received the call about Jesse's detention at 11:53, standing in the parking garage of her own building because her key card no longer worked in the elevator. She stood beside her car and listened with the particular stillness of someone absorbing a blow they had known was coming but had hoped, irrationally, might not arrive. She called her attorney. Her attorney called back in 6 minutes and told her the board action was technically within the company's governance bylaws, that the police warrant had originated from a complaint filed by Victor Hale in his capacity as co-executive director, and that she should not attempt to access the building until the review board convened in 48 hours. She asked if Jesse could be released. Bond had been set at a level clearly designed to delay rather than enable. She paid it that afternoon from personal funds. Jesse was released at 4:15. He did not call her. He went back to the church on West Fullerton. Diana called Margaret at 7 that evening. I found something else, Diana said. The supplementary authorization, the second document you signed. It explicitly extended the seal to include the safety audit covering the 2 passenger incidents and the ground crew injury. Those families were never told why their injuries happened. They filed claims that were settled under non-disclosure agreements. They signed away their right to know in exchange for payments they needed. She paused. Margaret, one of those families, the ground crew member, his name is Robert Tillman. He spent 6 years believing his spinal injury was his own fault. He changed careers. He lost his marriage during the recovery. He has never known that a sealed audit existed. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet apartment. "Does Jesse know about Mr. Tillman?" she said. "Not yet. Tell him everything," Margaret said. "All of it. Do not soften it." She ended the call. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Then she opened her phone and looked at the calendar reminder. Ethan, March 12th. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the 7 years of mornings she had walked past the closed door at the end of the hallway and looked straight ahead, and all the ways that walking straight ahead had been, at every turn, the wrong direction. She was not finished with this night yet, but she was finished with a certain kind of looking away. Diana told Jesse everything the following morning. He listened in the same still way he had listened to everything. When Diana finished, he sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor. "The families," he said. "Robert Tillman. He never knew." "No," Jesse nodded. He stood up. He walked to the narrow window and stood there for a long time, his back to the room. When he turned around, his expression had settled into something quiet and decided. "I want a lawyer who is not connected to her or the company," he said. "Can you find me one?" "Yes," Diana said. "Good," he said. "Because I am not going to let Victor make me disappear again. But I am not letting her fix this either." He looked at Diana directly. "This time, I am doing it myself." That afternoon, Victor Hale sent a message to Margaret through her attorney. The terms were precise and without ambiguity. If Margaret appeared before the board review and publicly stated, on record, that Jesse Calloway was not Ethan Caldwell, that she had been deceived by a manipulative individual, and that her judgment had been compromised, Victor would withdraw the police complaint, secure Jesse's full release, establish a private trust to fund Jesse's medical care for the remainder of his life, and ensure that Margaret faced no personal criminal liability for the non-disclosure authorizations. If she refused, Jesse would face prosecution. The supplementary authorization bearing her signature would be submitted to federal regulators, and Victor would personally ensure that every journalist covering the aerospace industry received the psychiatric records, the surveillance photographs, and a detailed account of how the chief executive officer of Caldwell Aerospace had spent 3 weeks attempting to replace her dead son with a homeless man. Margaret read the message twice. She set her phone down on the kitchen table and sat very still. The offer was not without logic. Jesse would be safe. She would be safe. Victor would keep his position and his contract and his carefully constructed version of events. And in 5 years, the story would be a rumor, and in 10 years, it would be nothing at all. She thought about Robert Tillman. She thought about 6 years of believing it was his own fault. She thought about a marriage that did not survive the recovery. She thought about the settlement he had signed, not knowing what he was signing away. She thought about Jesse at the window that morning, his hand on the frame, steadying himself. She thought about the door at the end of the hallway that she had not opened in 7 years. She picked up her phone. She did not call her attorney. She called the FBI field office in Chicago. The federal case moved faster than Margaret had expected, and slower than she could bear. The FBI field office assigned 2 agents to the matter within 72 hours of her call. She handed over everything: the email chains, the board meeting minutes, the vendor payment records, the harbor authority logs, the Marine captain's signed statement, the neurological facility's archived intake forms, both non-disclosure documents bearing her own signature, and a personal written statement detailing every decision she had made and every moment in which she had chosen not to ask a question she should have asked. Her attorney sat beside her throughout the 7-hour deposition and said very little because Margaret had instructed him to say very little. She was not interested in managing the narrative. She was interested in being accurate. Victor Hale was placed under federal arrest on a Friday morning, 11 days after Margaret's initial call. The charges were extensive obstruction of a federal aviation investigation, falsification of official records, unlawful detention, identity fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The arresting agents found him in his office, on the 38th floor of the Caldwell building, seated at his desk. Margaret's attorney told her later that this suggested either extraordinary composure or an extraordinary failure to anticipate consequences. She thought it was probably both. She submitted her resignation that morning, before the arrest, before anyone had asked her to. The letter was 4 sentences long. It did not explain or justify. It said she was resigning, effective immediately, and that she was doing so because it was the right thing to do and not because she had been asked. The identity confirmation took 3 weeks. 3 independent laboratories conducted DNA comparisons against Margaret's own profile. A cord blood sample collected at birth and stored in a private biobank, the DNA reference source the laboratories ultimately relied upon after it was retrieved and verified provided the definitive comparison point. The mitochondrial results were consistent across all 3 analyses. The nuclear DNA comparison confirmed a direct biological match at a statistical confidence level that the lead geneticist described, in her written report, as effectively conclusive. The titanium implant serial code was verified independently by the device's original manufacturer, who confirmed the device had been manufactured in a single-unit custom order for a specific surgical case at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The surgical case number matched Ethan Caldwell's orthopedic file. The federal prosecutor's office issued a formal statement confirming that Jesse Calloway was, with evidentiary certainty, Ethan James Caldwell, and that the identity under which he had been living for the preceding 7 years had been fraudulently created and administratively maintained through a criminal conspiracy originating with Victor Hale. Diana called Margaret when the statement was released. Margaret thanked her and ended the call quickly, because she did not want Diana to hear her voice at that particular moment. Ethan received the confirmation in a meeting with his attorney and Diana at the church on West Fullerton. Diana called Margaret that evening and told her what had happened. He had read all the documentation carefully, Diana said. Then, he had sat for a long time without speaking, his hands resting on the table, looking at the papers, the way you look at something that has rearranged the room around you. The church was quiet. Outside, a bus went by. When he finally spoke, his voice was even. "I do not feel like someone who has been found," he said. "I feel like someone who has been handed a very large thing and told to figure out what to do with it." Then he had said, "I need some time." He did not come to the hearing. He submitted a written statement through his attorney, confirming his cooperation with the federal proceedings but declining to appear in person. Margaret read it in its entirety, though it was not addressed to her. The last paragraph said, "I do not yet know who I am in relation to the person I am being told I was. I know what I remember, which is not much, and I know what I have been told, which is a great deal, and I understand that these 2 things will take time to become one thing, if they ever do. What I know with certainty is that something was taken from me without my consent, and that I intend to spend whatever time I have left rebuilding what I choose to keep and leaving behind what I do not. I am grateful to the investigators and legal professionals who worked to establish the truth. I ask for privacy as I determine what to do with it." Victor Hale entered a guilty plea 8 months later. He was sentenced to 19 years in federal prison. The dentist who had falsified the dental records received a suspended sentence in exchange for full cooperation. The captain of the maintenance tender was granted immunity. 2 Caldwell board members who had been aware of the non-disclosure scheme and taken no action were fined and permanently barred from serving as corporate officers. Margaret was not criminally charged. The federal prosecutor determined that her signatures on the authorization documents, while legally consequential, had been obtained through deliberate misrepresentation and did not meet the threshold for criminal culpability. She was required to appear before a federal regulatory panel and provide complete testimony. She did so without invoking any procedural protections. She also did something the prosecutor had not required, and her attorney had advised against. She established a personal compensation fund, funded by the liquidation of the majority of her Caldwell stock, for the families affected by the concealed safety incidents, the 2 injured passengers, the ground crew member, and the families of all 12 passengers on Flight 209. Robert Tillman attended the press conference at which the fund was announced. He did not speak to Margaret, but he was there, and she saw him across the room, a man in his early 40s, moving carefully, the way people move when their body has taught them to be cautious. She did not approach him. She had not earned that yet, but she held the fact of his presence in the room the way you hold something that costs you exactly what it should. Caldwell Aerospace did not dissolve. The defense contract was canceled, The company's valuation dropped by 61% in the first quarter following the criminal proceedings. 2 manufacturing facilities were sold. 1,800 employees were laid off, a fact that Margaret carried with her in a specific and unallocatable way that she suspected she would carry for the rest of her life. But Ethan's clean engine patent, filed under his legal name, submitted to the patent office by his attorney 3 weeks after the identity confirmation, attracted the attention of a renewable energy conglomerate that had been searching for exactly that technology for 4 years. They approached the restructured Caldwell board with an acquisition offer. The board accepted. The technology Ethan had been trying to release the day Victor had erased him was now, 7 years later, going to be built. He called her in November. Not to meet, just to call. He asked how she was. She said she was all right. He said he was all right too. The call lasted 9 minutes and covered very little of substance. And when it ended, Margaret sat in her kitchen for a long time thinking about how a 9-minute phone call could be both deeply insufficient and exactly enough. He had taken a small apartment near the rehabilitation center on the north side, where he had begun volunteering 3 mornings a week. She brought coffee to the neighborhood on Sunday mornings and sat in a cafe 2 blocks from his building and drank it alone. She was not sure whether this was appropriate. She did it anyway. One Sunday in early December, he walked into the cafe. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up from her cup. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The waitress came. He ordered coffee. They sat together for an hour and talked about small things, the neighborhood, the weather, a documentary he had watched at the rehabilitation center's common room, a memory he had recovered the previous week of a beach somewhere warm that he could not yet place geographically, but that had made him feel, he said, surprisingly calm. She listened. She did not fill the silences. When an hour had passed, he said he needed to go, and she said, of course, and they stood up, and he was almost to the door when he turned back. Same time next week, he said. Yes, she said. In March, the 12th of March, they drove to the lakeshore together. The day was cold and very clear, the kind of late winter clarity that comes just before the season turns, when the air has not yet decided what it wants to be. They stood at the edge of the water and watched the surface of Lake Michigan shift and settle. The Chicago skyline was visible to the south, assembled and exact against the pale sky. Ethan reached up and lifted the compass rose pendant from around his neck. He held it for a moment, turning it in his fingers, the brass worn smooth in places. The cord darkened with age and weather, and the particular kind of use that comes from carrying something everywhere without knowing why. Then he reached over and placed it in Margaret's hand and closed her fingers around it. She felt the weight of it, lighter than she expected, the way significant things often are. She held it. After a while, he took it back. He turned it over once, opened the back panel, read the 4 words he had known without knowing he knew them, and then closed it again. He lifted the cord over his head and settled the pendant against his chest. Not because he had returned to who he was, because for the first time, he was choosing who he would be. Margaret stood beside him and looked out at the water. She did not reach for his hand. She did not speak. She opened her phone, found the calendar reminder, Ethan, March 12th, and deleted it, not because she wanted to forget, because she did not need a placeholder anymore for something that was standing right beside her. The lake moved. The sky held. They stood together in the cold and watched the light change on the water, and it was enough. Not everything, not yet, but enough to be standing here, in the same place, at the same time, with the compass pointing north and the long way home still ahead of them.